Chapter 1. The illusion of a perfect life. Do you ever wonder if you really know the person you're lying next to every night? That was a question I had never thought to ask myself. My life with Marcus was beautifully, predictably simple. He was the calm to my chaos, and together, we had built what I thought was an unbreakable life. I spent my mornings in quiet gratitude, sipping coffee by the kitchen window as sunlight filtered through our garden, casting a soft glow on the room. Each day started with the same gentle routine, and I thought our love was safe in that steadiness. From the outside, our life looked picture-perfect. Marcus was a successful finance executive who worked hard to give us a life of comfort. I had my freelance work, which kept me busy but gave me the freedom to tend to our home and savor quiet moments. Together, we were the envy of many. Our friends commented on how fortunate we were, how well Marcus treated me, how solid our bond seemed. But sometimes, appearances can be deceiving. It started with a whisper of doubt, a phone call that ended abruptly when I walked into the room, a work trip that felt oddly timed. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But as the weeks went on, the whispers grew louder. I found myself wondering who this man really was, this man I had devoted my life to. Little did I know that I was on the edge of a revelation that would shatter my world. And the worst part? I had to confront not only the lies Marcus had told me, but the ones I had told myself. Author's note. It's in these seemingly small moments of doubt that so many of us start questioning what we think we know. What would you do if you realized that your whole life might be based on a lie? Would you have the courage to search for the truth? Chapter 2. The unveiling. I took a slow, steady breath and forced myself to fold the shirt carefully, as if nothing were wrong. My fingers trembled slightly, and I tucked the shirt back into the pile as if it hadn't just shattered the illusion of my life. My mind was racing, trying to piece together fragments of memories, conversations, moments when he'd been late or too quick to dismiss my questions. How many times had I seen him turn his phone screen away, assuming it was work or nothing important? How often had I ignored the feeling in my gut, telling myself I was overthinking? But now, I had something real, something undeniable. That shade of red was bold, vivid, a color I'd never even owned. And it wasn't just lipstick. It was proof of a world Marcus had kept hidden, of secrets he'd woven into the fabric of our marriage. That night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I couldn't stop myself from glancing at him, wondering if he could feel the weight of my silence. He was animated, talking about his day, oblivious to the quiet fury building inside me. My mind replayed the image of the shirt, that red smear that seemed to grow larger with each passing moment. I wanted to reach across the table, confront him, demand an explanation, but I didn't. Instead, I forced myself to listen, to smile at the right moments, to act as if nothing had changed. Over the next few days, I began gathering small clues, subtle hints. I'd watch him closely, noticing the way he glanced at his phone with a brief, almost anxious flick of his eyes. I started staying awake at night, waiting for him to drift off so I could quietly slip his phone out from under his pillow. Each time, I would scroll through his messages, his emails, carefully cataloging every suspicious interaction, every unexplained text. This wasn't just about uncovering his betrayal. It was about reclaiming control, taking back the power he thought he held over me. I didn't know how long this would take, or how much proof I'd need to gather, but I was willing to wait. Author's note. It's always difficult when we stumble upon the first sign of betrayal. Some would confront it immediately, while others, like Lydia, choose patience. What would you do? Would you gather proof or act on impulse? Chapter 3. The gathering storm. With every passing day, I learned to live a double life, just as he had been doing all along. To him, I remained the same supportive wife, nodding and smiling, laughing at his jokes, asking about his day. I played my role well, all the while keeping track of his deceptions like a detective logging evidence. It became second nature to smile politely while mentally cataloging every phone call he cut short, every late night he explained away. I had never known how sharp my mind could be when focused by hurt. I started noticing patterns in his behavior. Certain times he'd slip away to take work calls, or particular evenings he'd claim he needed to stay late. He thought he'd hidden it all so well, but with each new detail I uncovered, the cracks in his lies grew wider, exposing the ugly truth beneath. I stopped asking where he'd been and started mapping out the places he frequented. If he realized I was pulling away emotionally, he didn't let on. And maybe he was too wrapped up in his own deceit to notice. In those early hours of each morning, I would sit by my computer, transferring the money bit by bit into my own account, setting aside just enough to make sure I wouldn't be stranded when this was all over. It was as much about my freedom as it was about the principle. He would learn that his betrayal had cost him. I thought back to how I'd put my career on hold for him, how I'd trusted him so completely that I hadn't even questioned it when he took control of our finances. One night, as I stared at his phone screen flickering with another message from an unknown number, the words blurred before my eyes. The woman I'd been, the trusting wife who'd wanted nothing more than a quiet life together, felt distant, like a stranger I could barely recognize. I wasn't her anymore, and I wasn't going back. This was the beginning of my own independence, the start of a future where I wouldn't have to play the role he'd written for me. Each day I grew stronger, more focused. My life wasn't slipping away as it had in the beginning. I was taking it back, piece by piece. The satisfaction that gave me was small, but it was mine, and it would grow into something he'd never see coming. Author's note: betrayal often brings out strength we never knew we had. Watching Lydia's transformation from hurt to empowered is both inspiring and heartbreaking. Have you ever found strength in the face of betrayal? Chapter 4. Secrets and Lies. I remember sitting alone with the investigator's report, my hands trembling as I turned the pages. Each photo, each timestamp, felt like a stab to the heart. There was Marcus with her, laughing, his arm casually slung over her shoulders as they shared a private moment I thought was reserved only for us. In one photo, she wore the necklace I had unknowingly seen on our credit card bill. They looked so at ease, as if they had a world of their own, one he'd made by tearing apart mine. Strangely, my reaction was not what I'd expected. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. I felt a hollow sort of calm wash over me, like the eye of a storm. Marcus thought he'd hidden her well, thought his secrets were safe, but he didn't know that I had seen through him long ago. I was done pretending to be the unsuspecting wife. I was done giving him my quiet loyalty, my trust, my years. It was time he faced the woman he had underestimated, and I would make sure my exit left a mark he'd never forget. I started planning meticulously, down to the smallest detail. First, I safeguarded my finances. I created my own accounts, transferred money into them, and contacted a lawyer who understood exactly the kind of divorce I intended to pursue. This wasn't just about leaving him. It was about ensuring I wouldn't walk away empty-handed. He'd stripped away my trust, my love, and my sense of security. He wouldn't be taking my stability too. Then, I began the quiet process of packing up my life. I sorted through our belongings late at night, careful to take only what was truly mine, only the things he wouldn't miss in the weeks leading up to my departure. Each item I set aside felt like a small act of freedom, a piece of myself I was reclaiming. I left his things untouched, the life we had shared just as it had been, like a hollow shell for him to find once I was gone. On the outside, nothing had changed. I still smiled when he walked through the door, still kept up the same routines. But each morning, when he left for work, I'd let the mask slip just a little more, allowing myself a glimpse of the life waiting for me on the other side. I pictured my days without the weight of his lies, without the ache of loving someone who had betrayed me. I imagined freedom, the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. When everything was finally in place, I chose a Friday. He had left early for what he claimed was another weekend business trip, and I knew I'd have the house to myself for the next 2 days. I packed the last of my things, glancing around the empty rooms that had once felt so warm and full of love. I left a manila folder on the kitchen counter, filled with every scrap of evidence I'd collected. The receipts, the photos, the investigator's report. It was my parting gift to him, a silent message that I knew everything. Before I left, I took one last walk through the house, saying goodbye to each room. I thought of the memories we had made there, the laughter, the late nights, the small rituals of love I had once cherished. They felt distant now, like memories of another life. I closed the door quietly behind me, leaving behind the woman I had been for the woman I was becoming. As I drove away, I felt an immense, exhilarating sense of relief. My heart pounded with a mixture of nerves and excitement, the unknown stretching out before me like a road untraveled. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, I was free to find out on my own terms. That evening, I checked into a small hotel with my packed bags, feeling a strange sense of comfort in its anonymity. I wasn't anyone's wife, anyone's other half anymore. I was simply myself, untethered. I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky, realizing that I felt more at home in that unfamiliar room than I had in the house I had just left behind. By the time Marcus returned on Sunday, I was already gone, vanished from his life just as quickly as I discovered the truth. I imagined his shock, the panic that would set in as he searched the empty house, the cold, hollow silence that would echo where I once stood. I knew he'd find the folder, and that realization would crash over him, as relentless and devastating as his betrayal had been to me. In that moment, I didn't feel anger or regret. I felt only peace, a peace that had been hard-won and entirely my own. Author's note: there's something chilling about realizing the person you loved has created a separate life. When does love become indifference? And when does that indifference turn into the desire for revenge? Chapter 5. The plan. I moved through each day with a sense of purpose, a hidden resolve that steadied me even as my heart ached. I knew that Marcus was oblivious to the storm brewing around him. To him, I was still the quiet, supportive wife who went about her days without complaint. But behind the mask, I was someone else entirely, a woman who had shed her naivety and found her strength in the wake of his betrayal. The first step of my plan was to ensure I was protected. Every evening, while he slept, I meticulously cataloged our financial situation. I went through credit card statements, bank accounts, investments, every line item of our life together. There were hidden expenses I hadn't known about, of course, but they no longer stung. They simply fueled my determination. I made copies, filing away every record I could find, and compiling a portfolio that painted a clear picture of our assets. My lawyer assured me that we could claim a fair portion, but I wanted more than that. I wanted control. To prepare for my escape, I needed independence, financially and emotionally. I started taking on more freelance work, claiming it was just to keep busy, a little extra to contribute to the household. He seemed pleased by this, thinking I was helping us save. Little did he know that each paycheck I earned was carefully deposited into an account he would never touch. Every hour I worked, every penny I saved was a quiet victory, a step toward freedom he couldn't see. And then, I set a date, a day just 2 months away. He had a business trip scheduled, one he was particularly eager about, and I knew that would be my chance to leave. In the weeks leading up to it, I worked carefully and methodically, filling box after box with my things, but storing them out of sight. I wanted to be sure that when I left, I would take only what was mine, leaving him with the hollow shell of the life he had fractured. The night before he left, I sat across from him at the dinner table, trying to memorize every detail of his face, the way he spoke, the way he looked at me without a trace of guilt or remorse. I wanted to remember him just as he was, a man who could lie with ease, who could hurt without hesitation. The realization gave me a strange sense of calm. I didn't love him anymore. I barely recognized him. And somehow, that made my resolve feel even stronger. When he left the next morning, he kissed me on the cheek, a casual goodbye. I smiled, playing the part perfectly, my hands folded behind my back to hide their slight tremor. As I watched him walk out the door, I felt a shift deep within me, a release, like a weight lifting off my chest. The life I had known, the woman I had been, was about to end, and I was ready. That day, I worked quickly. I took only what was mine: clothes, a few sentimental items, my laptop, the documents I had painstakingly gathered. I left our wedding photos, the gifts he had given me, the memories he had tainted. Let him keep them. They belonged to a version of us that no longer existed. Before I left, I placed a small envelope on the coffee table in the living room. Inside were copies of every piece of evidence I had gathered: the receipts, the bank statements, The hotel bills, the photos from the investigator. I didn't need to leave a letter. The truth was spelled out clearly enough. I wanted him to feel the weight of his actions, to face the cold, undeniable truth of what he had done. As I walked out of the house, I paused for one last look. This was the place where I had once felt safe, where I had once believed in forever. But it was just a house now, a structure filled with lies, a monument to the betrayal I would leave behind. I closed the door quietly, as if sealing away the past, and I walked to my car with my head held high. Driving away felt surreal, a mixture of grief and exhilaration coursing through me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I had regained my power, my independence, and no one, not even Marcus, could take that from me. I imagined him returning home, tired from his trip, expecting to see me waiting as usual. Instead, he'd find the house eerily silent, the echo of his own footsteps reverberating off empty walls. I pictured him picking up the envelope, the dawning horror as he realized what he had lost, what he had so carelessly thrown away. And in that moment, I knew he'd understand just how deeply he'd underestimated me. As for me, I drove on into the night, ready to start a new chapter, a life on my own terms, built on strength, resilience, and a newfound sense of self. Author's note: sometimes, revenge isn't about getting even. It's about reclaiming power. Lydia's resolve is both frightening and exhilarating. Have you ever felt a desire for such calculated revenge? Chapter 6. The departure. As I closed the door behind me, the finality of it sank in. That house, once filled with warmth and promises, was now nothing more than walls, holding the remains of a life I'd left behind. I didn't feel sadness, only a strange, wondering how I had missed the signs, how I had convinced myself that love was enough to hold everything together. But I knew I couldn't keep carrying that weight. The anger, the resentment, they were shackles, tying me to a past that no longer served me. I wanted freedom, not just from Marcus, but from the hurt he had left behind. So, I began to release it, piece by piece. It was a quiet process, nothing dramatic. There were no grand epiphanies, just small moments where I chose to breathe through the pain and let it dissipate, like smoke clearing after a fire. Some nights, I would catch myself in the mirror, surprised at the calm in my own eyes. I didn't look like a woman betrayed anymore. I looked like someone who had survived, someone who was finally healing. I forgave him, not in a way that absolved him, but in a way that freed me. I realized forgiveness wasn't about condoning his actions or forgetting the pain he caused. It was about reclaiming my power, taking back the parts of me he tried to steal. As I let go, I found room to focus on myself again, on the things I'd neglected for too long. I started new hobbies, spent more time with friends, and allowed myself to dream of a future that was mine alone. Each day felt like a small victory, a step away from the shadows he had cast over my life. In the end, forgiving him was a gift I gave myself. It lifted a burden I hadn't realized was weighing me down, and in that newfound lightness, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. True, unbreakable peace. And with it came hope, a quiet whisper that my story was far from over, and the best chapters were yet to be written. Author's note: forgiveness is a complicated thing. It's not about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself. Have you ever struggled to forgive someone who hurt you deeply? Chapter 9. Rediscovering joy. Each morning began to feel like an invitation, a blank page waiting for whatever I chose to write on it. I woke up early, savoring the quiet as I brewed my coffee and sketched out ideas for my next painting. The colors, the brushes, the smell of paint. It all felt like a rediscovery, like meeting an old friend who still understood me perfectly. I'd sit by the window, lost in the rhythm of brushstrokes, as the morning sun cast warm patterns across my little apartment. I painted scenes from my past, fields bathed in golden light, foggy lakes, quiet corners of rooms I'd once felt safe in. Slowly, I noticed my paintings evolving, the colors growing brighter, the shapes more abstract, as if my heart was urging me to let go of old constraints and let my imagination roam free. On weekends, I'd pick a spot on the map, a park, a nearby town, or sometimes just a random street in the city. I'd wander with no plan in mind, letting myself get lost in the winding streets, trying new cafes, striking up conversations with strangers, and absorbing the world around me. Each walk felt like an adventure, a reminder that I was part of something larger than the narrow life I'd once confined myself to. Without Marcus, there was no rush to be anywhere, no anxious need to check my phone. I felt grounded. My nights were filled with simple joys, curled up with a book, listening to records, or dancing alone in my living room, moving freely without a single care about how I looked. It was liberating to feel so untethered, so unburdened by anyone else's judgments or opinions. For so long, I had held myself back, unconsciously molding myself into the person I thought Marcus wanted me to be. But that person was gone, and I felt a joy that came not from someone else's approval, but from the simple act of being true to myself. Friends noticed the change in me. They said I seemed lighter, happier, like a weight had been lifted. I'd smile and tell them they were right, that I was rediscovering myself, one small step at a time. The world felt wide open again, filled with endless possibilities. The things I once thought were out of reach, traveling, trying new things, building a career on my own powerful calm, as if I'd shed a heavy coat after carrying it through a long, dark winter. I carried my bags to the car, taking my time. I wanted to savor this moment, the start of something new, something that belonged solely to me. The quiet street was bathed in the soft glow of early evening, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. I was no longer just the woman standing in someone else's shadow, defined by his lies and my loyalty. I was becoming something stronger, someone who had chosen herself. I imagined the scene he'd return to, the quiet house, my missing belongings, and that manila folder sitting on the table, waiting like a ticking clock. He'd go through each page, each photo, his perfect world unraveling with every piece of evidence I had painstakingly gathered. The thought filled me with a quiet satisfaction. For all the times I had cried silently in the night, for all the times I had put him first, he would finally know the consequences of his betrayal. With a deep breath, I started the engine and pulled away, leaving behind the life I had built around him. As I drove, the tears I had held back began to fall, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being free. I wasn't sure what lay ahead, but I knew one thing. I would rebuild, on my terms, piece by piece. I was done doubting myself, done with feeling like I wasn't enough. Now, I was everything I needed to be. Author's note: leaving isn't easy, even when we know it's right. There's a strange mix of grief and relief, a sense of closure that comes with letting go of what was. Do you think you could have walked away with such strength? Chapter 7. The aftermath. At first, every day felt like a test. Simple things I'd never given much thought to, like fixing a leaky faucet or deciding what insurance to pick, suddenly seemed daunting. There were evenings I'd sit alone in my small apartment, exhausted from a day of navigating life on my own, wondering if I'd made the right choice. The silence, once welcome, sometimes grew heavy, reminding me of everything I'd lost. But slowly, those small victories began to stack up. Each bill I managed on my own, each new skill I learned, each challenge I faced head-on, it all became part of my transformation. I had always thought of myself as strong, but this was a new kind of strength. It wasn't just survival. It was resilience, the kind of resilience that's only born out of hardship. I took on new freelance projects, reaching out to contacts I'd neglected over the years. The work was difficult at times, but fulfilling, and it reminded me of the independence I'd once had, long before Marcus and I became a unit. Bit by bit, my confidence returned. It was as though I was discovering pieces of myself I'd forgotten existed. Some days, memories of our life together would surface unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a familiar scent, a couple laughing at a cafe, and a pang of sadness would hit me. I would wonder if, somewhere deep down, he missed me too. But those moments of doubt faded quickly. I reminded myself that the life we'd built had been based on lies, and the love I had poured into that life was now being redirected into myself. In the stillness of each new day, I was creating something authentic, something all my own. And with every step forward, I felt lighter, more sure of the path I was on. My life was far from perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I was proud of who I was becoming. Author's note: there's strength in the struggle, a resilience that comes from learning to stand on your own. Lydia's journey is a reminder that healing is a process, not a destination. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself from the ground up? Chapter 8. The temptation of forgiveness. Letting go wasn't easy. In those quiet hours, the memories had a way of creeping back, replaying like a film reel in my mind. The late nights, the whispered phone calls, the lipstick stain that had shattered my world. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling. Terms now felt attainable, even exciting. And most importantly, they felt like they were mine. In these quiet, joyful moments, I realized that healing wasn't just about moving on from Marcus. It was about rebuilding the relationship I had with myself. I'd spent so many years sacrificing my own needs, dimming my own light for someone else's comfort. Now, I was reclaiming those lost parts, honoring the dreams I'd once set aside, and treating myself with the kindness and respect I'd given to others. There were still moments when the past crept back, moments when a memory would sting or a familiar scent would remind me of what once was. But those moments grew softer, less frequent. I had learned that they were just echoes, reminders of a chapter that had ended. And with each passing day, those echoes faded, replaced by new experiences, by the vibrant colors of a life lived for myself. One evening, as I watched the sunset from my balcony, I felt a peace settle over me, a deep, unwavering sense of contentment that I hadn't felt in years. I no longer saw myself as a woman betrayed or as a wife left behind. I was simply a woman, whole and complete, stepping confidently into a future of her own making. For the first time in years, I was proud of the woman I had become. The scars, the hurt, the struggles, they had all shaped me, but they did not define me. As I sat there, sipping my tea, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange, I knew that this was just the beginning. My life was no longer bound by someone else's expectations or by the weight of a broken past. It was mine to fill with whatever I chose. And that realization brought a kind of joy and freedom that was worth everything I had endured. Author's note: rediscovering joy is one of the most beautiful parts of healing. Lydia's journey is a testament to the power of self-love and self-discovery. Have you ever found happiness in unexpected places? Chapter 10. A new beginning. As the city lights began to flicker outside my window, I reflected on the journey that had led me here. There had been so many dark days, moments when I doubted myself, when I wasn't sure I'd ever find peace. But as I sat there, wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea warming my hands, I felt a calm I couldn't remember feeling before. I thought back to the version of myself who had once been trapped in a life that wasn't truly hers. A woman who had allowed herself to shrink, to fade into the background to keep someone else comfortable. But that version of me was gone. I had shed that skin like an old coat, leaving it behind as I walked into a life that felt entirely my own. In my new apartment, each item had been chosen with intention. No more remnants of a shared life or someone else's tastes. The mismatched dishes I'd bought at a thrift shop, the cozy armchair by the window, the plants I was learning to care for, all were pieces of a new story, one I was writing for myself. They were symbols of resilience, little reminders that I could start over, that I could find beauty in simplicity. My days were filled with things I'd once abandoned: painting, writing, meeting friends for coffee, exploring new parts of the city. I'd even started volunteering at a local animal shelter, a small dream I'd set aside for years. In those simple moments, feeding a stray cat, laughing with a friend, capturing a sunset on canvas, I found myself again. I didn't need grand adventures or sweeping romance to feel complete. I found joy in the little rituals that made up my days: brewing a perfect cup of coffee in the morning, lighting a candle as I settled in to read, watering my plants on the weekends. These tiny acts, once overlooked, had become sacred. They were mine, small celebrations of the life I'd built. Sometimes, people would ask if I had started dating again, if I'd thought about moving on completely by finding someone new. I'd smile and say, maybe one day. But deep down, I knew I wasn't searching for anyone else to complete me. For the first time, I was more than enough. I was learning to savor my own company, to trust my instincts, and to live by my own standards. That evening, as I watched the city glowing softly under the night sky, I allowed myself a small smile. I was proud, not in a loud, boastful way, but in a quiet, steady way that came from knowing I had done the hard work. I had faced the truth, grieved, rebuilt, and emerged stronger. I'd left behind the bitterness, the anger, the sadness, letting each one fall away as I reclaimed parts of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. In that peace, I understood something important. Healing wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about absorbing those lessons, honoring the scars, and using them as fuel for a brighter future. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not even to myself. I was content in a way I hadn't thought possible, fully present in my own life, enjoying the quiet magic of it. I sat there for a long time, the city lights twinkling below, my heart full and steady. This was what freedom felt like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of peace, of self-love, of a quiet, unwavering strength that no one could ever take from me. I was free, and I was whole, and that was everything. As I turned out the light and climbed into bed, I felt a sense of belonging, to myself, to this new life I had created, to the woman I had become. And in the darkness, I whispered a soft promise to myself. I would never settle for less than this again. This happiness, this hard-won joy was mine, and I would cherish it. Author's note: there's something powerful about finding peace within yourself. Lydia's journey is a reminder that happiness comes from within, not from others. Have you ever felt truly at peace? Chapter 11. The return. He looked older, more worn. His confident facade faded. His voice cracked as he tried to explain, stumbling over excuses, saying he didn't know why he'd done what he did, that he never meant to hurt me. But his reasons, his regrets, they meant nothing to me now. I felt a strange detachment as he spoke, as if I were listening to a stranger recount a story I'd once read and left behind. I could see he was hoping for a reaction, a sign that his words still had the power to touch me. But I didn't flinch. I'd worked hard to build a life where his choices, his mistakes, no longer had any hold over me. I'd made peace with the past on my own terms, in my own time, and his apologies, however genuine they might have been, were too late. They were unnecessary. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement, a sign that I might forgive him and perhaps even let him back into my life. But all I felt was an overwhelming sense of calm, a quiet strength that filled every part of me. I realized that I didn't need to hold on to any anger or hurt anymore. I had let it all go long ago. I appreciate you reaching out, Marcus, I said gently, my voice steady. But I've moved forward, and I'm happy. I wish you peace and healing, but I don't need anything more from you. He blinked, clearly taken aback, as though he hadn't expected my resolve, my closure. There had been a time when I would have clung to his words, hoping they could somehow erase what had happened, fix what was broken. But that time had passed. I had spent too many nights crying over his mistakes, too many days picking up the pieces of my heart alone. I had found my own way to wholeness, and it didn't include him. As he walked away, I felt a deep sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted from me. It was the last thread tying me to that chapter of my life, and as it fell away, I felt more free than ever. I had healed, and in that healing, I had discovered a version of myself that didn't need anyone's validation or approval to feel complete. In that moment, I knew I'd finally achieved true closure, not because of his apology, but because I had built a life that was strong, whole, and filled with joy, all on my own. And as I turned and walked back to the life I'd created, I felt nothing but gratitude for my resilience, for my freedom, and for the unwavering strength I had found within myself. Author's note: sometimes we wait for apologies we don't need. Lydia's strength is a reminder that closure often comes from within. Do you think we ever truly need someone else's forgiveness to move on? Chapter 12. A life reclaimed. Every challenge, every tear, every sleepless night. They were all steps on the path that brought me here, to a place of resilience I never knew I possessed. There were times when I thought I couldn't possibly survive the pain. Times when the weight of betrayal felt like it might crush me. But each struggle taught me something essential, something I carry with me like armor. I've learned to trust my intuition, to stand tall on my own, and to embrace both the strength and the vulnerability that make me who I am. I look around at my little apartment, filled with pieces of me, my paintings on the walls, books stacked in every corner, a mismatched collection of teacups from thrift shops I visited on solitary adventures. Each item has its own story, its own memory, and together, they form a world that is uniquely mine. I used to fear solitude, thinking it meant loneliness. Now, I understand that solitude can be a source of comfort, a place to grow and reflect without anyone else's expectations clouding my mind. Friends ask if I regret the years I spent with Marcus, and my answer is always the same: no. Loving him, losing him, and ultimately leaving him all taught me to love myself in ways I never could have imagined before. I had to lose something precious to discover that I was the most precious thing in my own life. If I could go back and change it, erase the heartbreak, I wouldn't. Because in facing that darkness, I found a light within myself that I might never have known otherwise. I became the author of my own life, shaping it with care and intention, filling it with laughter, quiet moments, and a peace that's all my own. I don't need validation or anyone's approval. I'm here, living fully, because I chose to rise, to rebuild, to reclaim myself. And so, as I sit here, sipping my tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I feel a quiet, unwavering gratitude. This life, my life, isn't perfect, but it's mine. And if given the chance, I would walk that path again, because every step led me to this moment, this peace, this love for who I've become. Author's note: Lydia's story isn't just about betrayal. It's about resilience, growth, and the power of self-love. What would you take away from her journey? Would you have done things differently?